Hello, everyone. I think we are officially live now. Some nods from our speakers just to make sure everyone agrees that we're good to go and begin. Yes, I'd say so. All right. Well, hi. Hello to everyone and welcome to the session of Northern Justice Watch's live project seminar series. My name is Talia, here with Northern Justice Watch, and I'll be moderating today's talk between our two incredible speakers, which I will introduce in just a moment. If you don't mind, first, just to give you all a little overview of Northern Justice Watch and this project, especially if you're for the first time today. So Northern Justice Watch is a Canada-based collective with a commitment to upholding justice and challenging impunity, in particular through the work of providing legal and holistic support to victims of crimes, whether through international or domestic accountability mechanisms. And this live project seminar series, titled the Legal Understanding and Victim Empowerment Project, is a 2-year initiative funded by the Law Foundation of Ontario and run by Northern Justice Watch. And very much in line with the work and the mission of Northern Justice Watch, this project focuses on helping vulnerable communities in Ontario to better understand their legal rights and options when seeking justice. Welcome again to everyone, and thank you for being here today with us. Today's session marks the 7th installment of this series. And if you were lucky enough to be with us from the very beginning, you may remember other talks on topics such as national accountability mechanisms, as well as domestic accountability mechanisms here in Canada, as well as identifying human rights violations in your community and documenting and reporting human rights violations, among others. So today's topic is the very broad theme of gender-based violence. Now we have two wonderful speakers today, which will give us a better idea of all of these range of issues that exist within the realm of gender violence, from conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence in the context of the Yazidi community to how gender-based violence comes to play in relation to the regulation of speech and anti-discrimination right here in Canada. So without ado, if I may introduce our wonderful speakers in order of appearance. So first we will have Jamila Nasso. Jamila is our guest speaker today. We're very, very happy to have her for this session. Jamila is a Yazidi community leader, policy advisor, and strategic philanthropy and communications executive with over a decade of experience working at the intersection of genocide accountability, conflict-related sexual and gender violence, and access to justice. She's the founder and principal of Dara Advisory and has held senior roles in social responsibility and community investment, advising executives and institutions on government's impact and reconciliation-informed approaches. Jamila is president and co-founder of the Canadian Yazidi Association and co-led Operation Ezra, the world's largest privately sponsored Yazidi resettlement initiative, which helped shape Canada's response to the Yazidi genocide. She also advises Canada's War Crimes Program on its structural investigation into ISIS crimes against the Yazidi community. And in today's conversation, Jamila brings a survivor-centered, systems-level perspective on accountability and justice after mass atrocity. So we'll get to hear from her about a community perspective framing of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence grounded in the Yazidi genocide and its legal aftermath. Very much looking forward to that. Thank you so much, Jamila. Next, let me introduce our main speaker, Toby Mendel. Welcome, Toby. Toby Mendel is the founder and executive director of the Centre for Law and Democracy, a Canadian-based but globally respected national human rights organization, which focuses on foundational rights for democracy, including freedom of expression and access to information. Toby has nearly 3 decades of experience working on these rights, for example, having served for a very long time as the Senior Director for Law at Article 19 or as a Senior Human Rights Consultant at Oxfam Canada, as well as a Human Rights and Policy Analyst at the Canadian International Development Agency. His work, which has really been all over the world, he has collaborated extensively with civil society, governments, and governmental organizations on these areas and more, including UNESCO and the UN and other special rapporteurs on freedom of expression, not to mention having authored numerous articles, monographs, and books on these topics and others. Very important for us, he is also a very cherished advisor on Northern Justice Watch's advisory board. Thank you so much, Jamila. So back to Toby, sorry. Toby's presentation today will provide us with a really nice contrast to Jamila's, in which we'll look at a gender-based violence in the context of regulations on the kinds of speech which may promote or encourage gender-based violence. He'll do so with a lens primarily on Canada, but I think we'll also maybe get a bit of an understanding of how our legal landscape here contrasts with some other jurisdictions. So our outline for today is we will hear Jamila present for about 15 minutes, give or take, Toby for the greater part of the next hour, 45 minutes. Then we will have a break for 10 minutes and we'll reconvene after for a Q&A, where hopefully you can all ask some questions of interest and we'll have a little back and forth discussion here. That sounds great then. That's everything from me. I'm very looking forward to today's discussion. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Jamila?
Okay, great. I think we'll just get those slides up now. Great, and the screen looks ready to go. Okay, so thank you, Talia, and thank you very much to the Northern Justice Watch and the Live Project team for convening this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it, and especially to Toby's comments and presentation later on. And if we can go to the second slide now, please. We go. I just want to begin by grounding us in a critical distinction because how we define gender-based violence determines how the law responds. So all gender-based violence is serious and demands legal response, of course, but conflict-related sexual violence and gender-based violence, however, has a distinct legal character, and that is in its strategic, organized, and deliberate use as a tactic of war. So CRSV, GBV for short, is deployed to terrorize populations, dismantle families, enforce displacement, and permanently alter community identity. So when sexual violence is used this way, it constitutes a war crime, a crime against humanity, and in certain contexts, an act of genocide. And it's also important to say clearly that the Yazidi experience is not an anomaly. We see this sort of all over the world right now. Conflict-related sexual violence and gender-based violence is used repeatedly and deliberately by both state and non-state actors in contemporary conflicts today. And it is a tool of control, intimidation, and demographic engineering. International law recognizes this pattern. Domestic systems far often do not, or just responses is on the weaker side of things. So I'm speaking today from a Yazidi community lens, informed by years of advocacy across Iraq, international forums, and of course, Canadian legal systems. That is to say, I'm not speaking as a legal counsel, but as someone who has worked closely with survivors navigating these systems that quite frankly, have never been designed to respond to violence on this scale, in this intent, or in this duration. So to understand what CRSV and GBV does to a community, I want to start in Iraq because that is where the legal and human afterlife of these crimes is most visible for the Yazidi community. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so first, who the Yazidis are. The Yazidis are an indigenous ethno-religious minority from northern Iraq, historically rooted in the Sinjar region. Our faith is ancient, dates back millennia, and is distinct for its centuries. And really because of the Yazidis' religious belief being outside the dominant systems of political and legal sort of area, it's important to note that that vulnerability is not just background context, it's central to understanding why genocide occurred. So in August of 2014, ISIS attacked the Sinjar area with explicit intent. Yazidis were not caught in the crossfires of conflict. They were deliberately targeted. ISIS issued religious decrees declaring Yazidis to be non-believers, non-people of the book, whose killing and enslavement and erasure were essentially permitted. And the record is clear. Approximately 7,000 Yazidis were killed during that span of time. 6,417 women and girls were abducted and subjected to sexual slavery. Boys were forcibly separated and indoctrinated as cubs of the caliphate. And those who resisted conversion were ultimately executed and buried in mass graves. The sexual violence was not just a byproduct of the war and invasion, it was a system of governance. ISIS maintained registries of captives, operated slave markets all across Iraq and Syria, set prices for women and girls, and coordinated transfer across Iraq, Syria, and neighboring countries. So that level of organization and intent is precisely why these crimes meet the legal definition of genocide. So today, those consequences of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence continue to shape every aspect of survivors' lives. Today, more than 2,600 Yazidi women and children remain missing. And this is not only a humanitarian crisis, of course, it's a legal one. Families cannot obtain death certificates, survivors cannot resolve guardianship, inheritance, or civil status. Justice remains suspended because accountability has not been delivered, at all. So across Iraq, also today, over 200,000 Yazidis remain displaced, many still in camps, unable to return to Sinjar due to the insecurity, fragmented governance, and the pressure and presence of armed groups in the region. And for women, of course, this displacement compounds exposure to exploitation, abuse, and legal invisibility. We can go to the next slide, please. So CRSV and GBV also produces gendered legal consequences long after physical survival. So this includes stigma, family separation, loss of guardianship, disrupted inheritance rights, and the erosion of legal identity itself. And each country, of course, has its own legal structuring. So in Iraq, these harms are compounded by legal and religious frameworks in which religious identity is transmitted through the father. So for Yazidi women and any women who were survivors of ISIS, but any sort of rape or incident like that, who are survivors of such actions, children born of that sexual violence are often legally classified according to the father's religion. So even when that father is an ISIS perpetrator in this case, and this embeds CRSV and GBV directly into family law, into citizenship and social belonging, forcing survivors into impossible legal positions. So in response to a lot of this, the Iraqi parliament passed the Yazidi Survivors Law in 2021, which was intended to provide reparations for women who survived ISIS atrocities. And now, like most instances, law on paper looks great, but the actual application of it tells a very different story. So implementation remains deeply uneven. Fewer than 30% of eligible survivors have received reparations to date. And access to land remains pretty rare. So for many women, even applying requires returning to Iraq. We know since post-genocide, much of the community has gone to countries like Germany, Canada, Australia, and further. So just forcing those in the diaspora now to return to Iraq is, again, shifting the burden of justice back onto survivors and exposing them to renewed insecurity and re-traumatization. So under international law, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes trigger obligations that extend beyond national borders, creating this shared responsibility when domestic systems cannot or will not deliver justice. And that will take us give us a international landscape now. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So internationally, the UN established UNITAD to collect and preserve evidence of ISIS crimes, including genocide and CRSV and GBV. UNITAD documented mass graves, preserved survivor testimonies, and built on the most comprehensive evidentiary records related to ISIS crimes, really anywhere in the world. Yet UNITAD's mandate, of course, ended in 2024, before any prosecutions were meaningfully realized in Iraq, where most of the crimes did occur. That's not to say there have been some important breakthroughs within universal jurisdictions. Courts in Germany secured the world's first conviction of ISIS member for genocide against the Yazidis. There's been cases in Netherlands, Sweden, Belgium have resulted in convictions for crimes against humanity and genocide links to the Yazidi enslavement. And these cases do matter. They demonstrate that accountability for CRSV is legally possible, but they also expose the limits of an approach that relies on a small number of national courts, while the primary sites of harm remain without international crimes prosecutions. And in Iraq itself, prosecutions continue primarily under counterterrorism law, not under genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes frameworks. So as a result, of course, CRSV remains legally unaddressed. And really, these accountability failures are unfolding amid renewed instability in Iraq and Syria and across the region. We know detention camps and prisons holding ISIS-affiliated individuals remain deeply insecure. ISIS-linked facilities have been repeatedly targeted, including successful prison breaks attempts just recently within the past few weeks. And for Yazidi survivors, this isn't just, geopolitics. It determines whether missing women and children will ever be found, whether perpetrators will face justice or disappear into instability, and whether return to Sinjar will ever be possible. And just to note, again, that's almost 12 years now, and failure is not the lack of evidence in this case. It really is the failure to act on it, both domestically and within an international framework. To the next slide, please. So now we'll bring it back to a Canadian context. So Canada's responsibility essentially beyond resettlement. What does this look like? Canada not primarily as a place of refuge, but as a legal and institutional actor whose response was, really shaped by community leadership long before federal systems were prepared to act in the Yazidi case. In 2015, as the genocide was unfolding, and international accountability mechanisms had not been materialized, Operation Ezra and the Canadian Yazidi Association, really led by survivors, community members, and allies, privately sponsored 73 Yazidi survivors. And this was one of the earliest community-led responses anywhere in the world, and the largest. And in this case, the local action did not remain just local, with sustained advocacy by Yazidi-led organizations and allies, which contributed to the national political recognition. And then we saw in 2016, Canada became one of the first countries in the world to formally recognize that ISIS committed genocide against the Yazidi people through a unanimous parliamentary motion. And this validated survivor testimony, named the crimes accurately, and created a political and legal space for further action. And now so that followed in 2017. Following that recognition, the government of Canada adopted a motion to resettle approximately 1,200 survivors of ISIS, and the majority of whom were Yazidi women who were survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and gender-based violence. So this marked a significant federal intervention built on the groundwork laid at really the community level. So in parallel to these resettlement and recognition efforts, Canada activated its war crimes program, initiating a structural investigation into ISIS crimes against the Yazidi people. So signaling that Canada's responsibility extended beyond protection to accountability. So when survivors arrived, however, it became clear that Canada's systems were unprepared for the depth and complexity of trauma caused by genocide and CRSV. Survivors were navigating housing, schooling for children, medical care, and legal processes at the same time. And too often, there was no coordinated trauma-informed pathway designed for genocide survivors. It's essentially a sort of one-size-fits-all model we had. So in Winnipeg, we actually emerged here as one of the most successful resettlement sites in Canada, not because our systems were ready or settlement agencies had a step ahead, but because the community organized when institutions could not. So Operation Ezra and the Canadian Yazidi Association, we essentially took on the resettlement role of coordinating housing, healthcare navigation, mental health supports, cultural orientation, and survivor-centered advocacy. So this local success continued to shape national policy. And in 2023, Canada introduced a family reunification public policy, which intended to reconnect up to 400 Yazidi families separated by the genocide and displacement, of course. So for survivors, family reunification is not simply ancillary. It's central to recovery, stability, and dignity. And that was, one of the most important causes and issues that survivors kept telling us when we were asking, what it is we can do to help, this justice and healing process. It was family reunification was always front and center to that. So yet, even here, we know systemic limits remain. Survivors are often required to reconstruct family relationships, produce documentation destroyed during genocide, and that burden heavily falls on women in this particular case. And Canada's own national evidence base underscores why legal literacy matters. There was a recent report from the Office of the Federal Ombudsperson for Victims of Crime, which found that only 6% of sexual assaults in Canada are reported to police, largely because survivors fear being disbelieved, re-traumatized, or harmed by the process. So that investigation was grounded in survivor expertise at scale, including 1,000 survivor surveys responses and over 107 survivor interviews, really underscoring that these are not isolated experiences, but systemic patterns. And if you just go to the last slide. So I'll just end by underscoring this. Access to justice is not about whether laws exist. It's about whether survivors can understand them, can trust them, or use them safely. And in Canada, that responsibility begins at home by making rights real in practice through clear information, enforceable protection, and trauma-informed pathways that don't require survivors to sacrifice their well-being in order to be believed or to access justice. And I will stop there and pass it back to Talia.
Thank you so much, Jamila. What an important approach to be able to hear from the community perspective and really how these initiatives start from the ground up. Work from people from yourself and other community members and civil society. I won't expand too much on what you said just now because we're a bit late on time. So please let me pass this on to Toby. Take your time. No need to squeeze it down, however much time you need for your presentation. If all the viewers are okay with that, I think it's really best to just hear everyone out. When we're finished with Toby's presentation, we'll have a brief 10-minute break. So please, Toby, go ahead.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks, Jamila. That was a very powerful presentation. Let me share my slides. Hopefully that's visible to everyone. Is it? Yeah, okay, I can't see it though. Sorry. Yeah, so my presentation is going to focus on how we regulate the types of speech that contribute to or exacerbate gender-based violence. So, the legal regulation of sort of harmful speech, speech that attacks equality, essentially. I'm going to mostly focus on Canada, as Talia said, but I will certainly look at international standards in this area, particularly in the area of hate speech. There's been international law has a very clear set of standards on that, which countries like Canada are legally required to align with, and I think Canada largely does, but of course every other country is supposed to do that as well. So we'll look at the international standards and then look at the Canadian standards, and I'll look at a couple of key criminal bans on equality attacking speech. So hate speech is the main one, and I'll spend more time on that because it is a much more developed area of law. But I will also look at another rule in Canada, which is the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, introduced in 2015. So the hate speech laws go back much earlier than that. And Canada is one of the earlier countries to introduce such legislation, but it is now kind of spreading around the world. So Canada's played a little bit of a leadership role on that. And then I'm going to look at what I will call emerging digital rules. For those who have experienced gender-based violence, probably many of you, it's online that the harm starts. It's online that the harshest and most problematical misogynist and attacking and harassing content exists. And for a very long time, nobody regulated that. Like platforms were just kind of let to go free and do whatever they wanted. That's no longer the case, at least in some jurisdictions in the world. And I'll talk about what's happening in Europe, because Europe is the most advanced jurisdiction. And then I'll look at what the proposals Canada had in the last parliament, those died with that parliament, so they didn't get passed before the parliament was brought to an end. But I understand that they're coming back. So interesting for us. Okay, on hate speech, and I just want to I'm going to focus on the criminal prohibition of hate speech primarily, because that's the leading piece, really. But I do want to just paint the scope of the issue, because there are other ways to deal with hate or biased speech. So criminal bans on making hate speech statements, that's the main play. But in Canada and in many countries, you can also bring a civil case if you have lost something, if you have actually suffered a direct loss, usually a financial loss, but also other losses by hate speech. You can bring a civil case to recoup that loss, so private case between you and the perpetrator of the hate speech. Human rights codes in some cases treat hate speech as discrimination. That is quite controversial in Canada. It was struck down. It wasn't struck down. The Supreme Court had a case which upheld those rules, but with strong constraints. But it was politically very unpopular, and most jurisdictions did away with that. So there's only a couple of jurisdictions in Canada which still maintain those rules. And then a lot of countries in the world have heavier penalties when crimes are inspired by hate. So just any crime, an ordinary crime, so an assault, the sorts of things that Jamila was talking about, the heinous crimes that were perpetrated on the Yazidis. So if those crimes were perpetrated in Canada, at the moment, we don't have a specific provision on that, but there is a bill before Parliament. It's called Bill C9, and it would introduce much heavier penalties where you perpetrate a crime which was inspired by hate. So, if you assault a woman in a misogynist way or in a sexist way, you're not just going to attract the regular sanction for that assault. You're going to attract a much higher sanction. So, sort of as a means of trying to discourage those things. And then the structural measures, which we'll look at in the second part of it. I do just want to mention that beyond the kind of strict legal rules that you find in the criminal law, the civil law, there are also media outlets often subscribe to self-regulatory standards, and in most cases, the standards that media take on for themselves in this space are much stricter than the criminal rules in Canada. So, for example, the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, the CAB, has an equitable portrayal code, so a code that almost all broadcasters in Canada subscribe to, and it talks about not just hate speech, which we'll get into in a second, but refrain from airing unduly negative portrayals. So you're not supposed to sort of be negative about different groups, and the list of groups there: persons with race, nationality, ethnic origin, color, religion, gender, sexual orientation, marital status. So long list of grounds on which you're not supposed to do that. And then in further elaboration of what negative portrayal could mean, again, the second yellow highlight there: stereotyping, just stereotyping. So that's certainly not a criminal offense in Canada, but the media are supposed to avoid it. Stigmatization and victimization, derision of myths, traditions or practices, degrading material, and exploitation. So the media set up much higher standards for themselves than the criminal code sets for all speakers. I think it's important for us to recognize that. And if you see something in the media which you don't think is meeting these standards, which are quite strict, then you can complain, and there's a whole system for complaints and processing of complaints. It's not through the courts, it's through a voluntary self-regulatory body, but it's still quite effective. Okay, so looking at the international legal standards on hate speech, we have Article 22 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's an international treaty which has been ratified, I think, by 174 countries. It was 173 for years and years, and then it notched up by one, and I But just looked that up recently, so I think it's still there unless somebody else has ratified it. Sorry, and it says any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. So we're going to come back and deconstruct what that means. That's the essence of the hate speech standard under international law. That is what hate speech is under international law. I just want to mention as well, Article 19 of the ICCPR is the one that guarantees freedom of expression. So obviously hate speech is a restriction on freedom of expression. You know, hate speech is speech and we're restricting it. We're not allowing it. We're prohibiting it. Article 19.2 guarantees free speech, and Article 19.3 authorizes restrictions on speech. And I think the participants here can receive these slides, so I won't kind of go into detail on this test here, but that's the test in Article 19.3, the test for restrictions. And I just would like to mention that Article 21 is about propaganda for war and 2 is about hate speech, so we've only quoted 2 up there. That's the only case where the ICCPR and generally speaking international human rights law specifically requires states to ban speech. Article 19.3 says, you know, the right may be restricted. If states want to restrict it, they can, subject to these conditions. But Article 22 says, no, it's not just a may restrict situation. You have to ban this speech because this speech is so toxic to equality and to, you know, the whole human rights project. So that's a kind of an interesting element of it. Just to mention, I mean, obviously it's clear that Article 22 is compatible with and subject to Article 19.3. So the 2 of them kind of articulate together, they work together. I mean, from a technical legal point of view, that's quite important. If people want a little to discuss that in the Q&A, that, you know, certainly happy to talk about that. So what are the key elements of Article 22? The first is that there should be advocacy of hatred, the first word in it, which signals intention. And I'm going to kind of go in and deconstruct each of these. The advocacy must be of hatred. So we're going to talk a little bit about what hatred is. The hatred must be based on nationality, race, or religion. It has to constitute incitement. The incitement must be to discrimination, hostility, or violence. And then it must be prohibited by law. So I'm just going to deconstruct quickly each of these because they each hold the key to a key part of what hate speech legislation is about. So advocacy is understood very clearly under international law to be intent. So the speaker must intend to incite hatred. So if you say something, you know, stupid, let's say, and you don't really mean anything by it, but other people take it in a way that you didn't expect and start to hate someone, you're not going to be responsible for hate speech. You have to want the negative thing to happen. It's a specific form of intent. You have to want hatred to be incited. That has to be your aim when you speak. And I just mentioned a couple of legal cases there, which, you know, kind of drill into it. And I mean, Herseld versus Denmark was a case before the European Court of Human Rights. There's a quote, this is a quote, it says an important factor in the court's evaluation will be whether the item in question, when considered as a whole, appeared from an objective point of view to have had as its purpose the propagation of racist views and ideas. The purpose of the speaker in saying what, in this case, he said, you know, was it to propagate racist views? And this is kind of an interesting case because in this case, Herseld was a journalist working with the public broadcaster, so the CBC journalist in the Canadian context. This was in Denmark. And he had gone out in Denmark and filmed some really nasty racist people and, you know, filmed what they had said, the racist things they were saying and sort of, but his objective was to expose them and to tell people in Denmark, hey, you know, things aren't so nice around here. We've got these kind of people living here saying these nasty things. You know, we need to be aware of that. But when this show aired on TV, the people, the racists involved, they were prosecuted and convicted of hate speech properly because they were engaging in hate speech. But Hesed was also convicted because he had propagated this hate speech. He had put it on television. So, these guys were just speaking in their little place or whatever, and he'd taken it and distributed it to the whole of the Danish population. And so it went to the European Court of Human Rights, and they said, well, hang on a second. He did disseminate hate speech, but his goal was actually to combat hate speech, and so he can't be, convicted of that. So I think it's a really interesting case to show, how intent is really important. And in his case, of course, the intent was the complete opposite. He wanted to tell Danes, look, we have this thing here, and you need to kind of be on it. So what is hatred? The key notion here. And it's kind of interesting because actually there's almost nothing in international law which defines hate speech. And a while ago, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, so, the chief UN official that deals with human rights, made this statement: implementation of the hate speech rules is weak, partly because of the lack of clarity on key elements of the law, such as the definition of incitement, hatred, and hate speech. So hatred and hate speech, key things which were not defined there. And we have the benefit in Canada of having our Supreme Court having decided a case where it spent quite a lot of time elaborating on what hatred was. And it said that hatred is the most extreme emotion that belies reason, an emotion that, if exercised against members of an identifiable group, implies that those individuals are to be despised, scorned, denied respect, and made subject to ill treatment on the basis of group affiliation. So we are not talking here about stereotypes, about prejudices. We're talking about something stronger than that. We all carry stereotypes. I think it would be I challenge anyone to say that they don't have any stereotypes inside of their head. I don't believe that that's possible for anyone. It's not a great thing, but it's just a factor of being a human being. Hate speech is a higher level than that. It's an extreme emotion. And interestingly, Bill C9, which I mentioned before, a bill on basically on hate speech, currently before the Canadian Parliament, for the first time introduces a definition into the law. So we have the Supreme Court decision, which is effectively a definition, but this will make that definition legal. We have actually criticized that because we don't feel that the definition in the law that they've introduced is as strong as the Supreme Court definition. So we called on them to enhance that. Okay, if we look at the ICCPR Article 22, it only talks about hatred on the basis of race, nationality, and religion. So that would not, for example, include women. But it was drafted in 1966 in the shadow of the Second World War. This is a very limited list, I would say. Almost all national laws go much further than that. And I mean, in terms of the assessment under Article 19.3, would those laws be legitimate? I think it's clear that they would. I think that Article 22 requires states just to ban those three types of hate speech, but nobody limits it to that. And you can see, the national laws often extend to other immutable characteristics, historically disadvantaged groups, ethnicity, color, sexual and gender orientation, gender. Those are commonly found in these laws. So the ICCPR is a little bit limited in that area. But I would mention that, hatred on the basis of politics is not generally included in these rules. And, you can change your politics from day to day, but you can't so easily change things like your gender or your ethnicity or things like that. So it's the idea is to focus not on your belief systems and things, but your more fundamental characteristics than that. Okay, incitement, which really at the core of this is, I would say, certainly a complex and to some extent a controversial concept. The key idea here is that there should be a close nexus between the statement and the risk. So if I'm sort of talking rubbish to myself somewhere and nobody's listening to me or believing me or whatever, it's not going to qualify as incitement. You have to really motivate those other people to hate. Really, instill this hatred in them. Your speech has to be responsible for that. And I think I'm going to skip over this a little bit because it's quite complicated and it's perhaps a little bit too technical and legal. Courts look for causation factors. Did the speech actually result in hatred? Like, after listening to it, were people more was hate motivated, as it were. And I mean, the Human Rights Committee, which is the UN body that applies the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, there was a case from Canada, quite a famous case a long time ago, Ross in Canada, and Ross was a teacher in a secondary school, and he didn't bring his views into the school, but he was a renowned anti-Semite in the community, and he would, published and gave talks, anti-Semitic talks and things. And the Supreme Court of Canada held that it was possible to reasonably anticipate the causal relationship between the statements and what it had found to be a poisoned environment in the school. So even though the teacher didn't make those statements in school, kids were obviously hearing them and picking them up, and that had created a poisoned environment in the school. So and the UN Human Rights Committee relied on that finding by the Supreme Court of Canada to say that the measures that were imposed on Ross for this speech were legitimate. It was a proper case of restricting hate speech. Context is also very important, and there are two cases from Turkey which can be contrasted with each other. In one, the person was the former mayor of a major town in the southeast of Turkey, where a lot of activity, violent activity, was happening. And his statements coincided with murderous attacks, so they said, okay, that's that speech is inciting those attacks. We can see the connection there. In another case, in a city in the very western part of Turkey, a long way from the violence, and the European court again said, that the applicant wasn't responsible for the problems of terrorism in Turkey. He was just complaining about unfairness. Tone is relevant, so the way in which you speak, and again in Inco, the tone the court held was not inciting. It was calm, it was measured. He was upset about discrimination against his group, but he wasn't inciting hatred against other groups. And importantly, in many countries, including in Canada, as we will see in a minute, truth is a defense. So if you say something that you can show is true, doesn't matter what your intent was, doesn't matter what the result was, you're allowed to say true things, even if they cause harm among groups. Prescribed results. So these are discrimination, hostility, and violence. So those are built into the very text of the provision. Incitement to violence. Violence is a crime in every country. Incitement to violence, therefore, is also a crime. You can't incite people to commit a crime. So violence is uncontroversial in this area. Likewise, discrimination is a prohibited act around the world, and I think in almost every country. So incitement to discrimination through speech is also, it's very reasonable to restrict that. The one that is more controversial, although certainly included within it, is incitement to hostility. Hostility is simply a state of mind. You don't have to do anything. Sorry about that. I'm just going to let that ring. You don't have to do anything. You just have to have inside of your head hatred. So misogyny, for example, in the gender-based violence context. And if you incite others to that form of hatred, that itself qualifies as hate speech. So you don't have to incite people to rush out and do something. If you incite them simply to hate, that is enough to qualify as hate speech. Some protections, again, the special rapporteurs, there are 4 special rapporteurs on freedom of expression, one at the UN, one at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, so that's sort of Europe and North America, one at the Organization of American States, so that's the Americas, and one in Africa, so for the continent of Africa, and they sometimes come together and make joint statements on things, and they made a joint statement in 2001 about hate speech, and they set out some of these rules on it. So again, the idea that people should not be penalized for statements which are true, even if those statements are harmful. No one should be penalized for the dissemination of hate speech unless, again, the intent requirement there. And they recognized, and this is a little bit going back to the Herschel case, journalists should be able to decide, for themselves within their professional standards, what is the best way to talk about hate speech in your own community? In the Herschel case, he aired the statements. That was a bit radical, obviously got him into trouble initially with the Danish authorities because he was convicted of hate speech. But the special rapporteurs are saying, let journalists, they're the professional communicators, let them decide, how they want to communicate about the problem of racism in their society. So a couple of other protections there. All right, moving on to Canada. So what are the rules on this in Canada? So firstly, we have, these are all criminal code provisions. So section 318 of the criminal code makes it a crime to advocate or promote genocide against national, ethnical, racial, or religious groups. So that would not include women. Just to point that out. It's an indictable offense punishable by up to 5 years imprisonment. And interestingly, you can't bring a prosecution for genocide in Canada without the consent of an attorney general. So that could be the Attorney General of Canada or the Attorney General of a province, but you can't bring a case on your own, and even a prosecutor can't bring a case. The Attorney General needs to say, okay, this meets the standards, we're going to go ahead with this prosecution. So that's a significant, I won't say barrier, but a bottleneck to go through. So section 319(1) makes it a crime to publicly incite hatred where this is likely to lead to a breach of the peace. So there, hatred is not enough. You've got to couple hatred with a breach of the peace. So somebody has to go out and actually commit some violence, basically. It's a 2-year penalty. And on this one, the Attorney General's consent is not needed. So even an individual can bring a private prosecution for this, or a prosecutor could. Section 319(2) willfully promotes hatred via a public statement. So this is now much broader. This is willfully promoting hatred via public statement, that you don't have to incite a breach of the peace, you just need to incite hatred. But again, you need the Attorney General's consent to prosecute. So this is the one that is the most commonly used, not that it's commonly used, but it's the main hate speech provision, I would say, in Canada, the one that's the broadest in scope. Section 319 2.1 was added a few years ago, and it talks about willfully promoting anti-Semitism by condoning, denying, or downplaying the Holocaust. So from my point of view, that is simply a specific example of 319(2), promoting hatred against a group, in this case, against Jews, by condoning the Holocaust. It's just a specific example of that. And just to mention, Bill C-9 will add in incitement or promotion of hatred by displaying terrorist or Nazi symbols. And again, for me, that's just another specific example of 319(2). Promoting hatred via a public statement, displaying a terrorist or national symbol is a public statement, so it's a specific example of that. So from my point of view as a free speech person, I'm not very enthusiastic about 319 2.1 or the additional offense in C9. We cover all of these things in 319(2). It's good enough. It covers everything. Why do we need these specific offenses? But that's what's going on. And there's a number of defenses. Truth is a defense. An opinion on a religious topic is a defense. And it's important to note that attacking the believers of a religion, people, is included within hate speech offenses, but attacking a religion is not. A religion is considered an idea under international law, and you're allowed to say things about religion. People may not like them, people may be offended by them, but you're still free to say them because, offense, if I say something that offends you, that doesn't mean that I'm not allowed to say it. I have to harm you for me not to be able to say it. If I attack you as a religious believer, now I'm undermining your equality and I'm harming you. But if I just say something about religion, you might not like it. You don't have to listen to it. I'm free to do that. So, international law distinguishes quite carefully hate speech, which attacks people on the basis of their beliefs, from criticism of religion, which attacks a religion and not the believers per se. Okay. Moving on from hate speech. So another important rule for victims in Canada, which was introduced in 2015, so just about 10 years ago. And as I mentioned, this was kind of cutting edge at the time. It's still a little bit cutting edge, but it's spreading around the world. So we have section 162.1, and it's an offense to knowingly publish an intimate image, knowing or that there was no consent for that. So you didn't, the person involved didn't say you can spread this or share this, or exhibiting reckless disregard as to that. So you're not interested in whether there was consent or not, you just spread it. You can be imprisoned for up to 5 years for this offense. And the offense defines an intimate image. An intimate image is one that exposes sexual parts of the body or a person engaging in a sexual act. So if you're clearly engaging in a sexual act, even if you can't see anything, as it were, that is included. And the person involved had to have a reasonable expectation of privacy at the time, both that the recording was taken and at the time of publication. So, I mean, that would cover most cases, because most people engaging in nudity or sexual acts don't want that to be shared. So they, and it's reasonable for them not to expect that. So that's the offense. That's the crime. There is one defense, that the image or the intimate image served the public good, and it did not extend beyond what served the public good. So, for example, this is slightly contrived, but for example, you have a member of the parliament who's always going on about morality and family values and things, and that person is engaged in, extramarital sexual behavior. Perhaps you could, show an image of that and say, I'm exposing the hypocrisy of this person, and I believe that to be in the public good. Of course, you might have to justify that before a court, but that would be a possible example where you could make that argument. Like all criminal laws, it's non-retroactive. So if images were taken before 2015, they will not be captured by this. Nobody can be guilty of an offense which wasn't an offense at the time they did it. That's a very fundamental principle of both international and, most, and including Canadian criminal law. And importantly, because Yamila talked about, the re-victimization through the criminal process, the Crown, so the prosecution, can apply for a publication ban on any information that could identify the victim or witness. So, you're making a complaint about this, you're bringing a criminal case, you don't want that to be made public, because, that would be probably re-victimize you, but also involve all kinds of personal things that you just don't want to be in the public zone. That's one of the big problems with criminal, sexual abuse prosecutions. So this one allows for that, and the court will grant that where it's necessary for the proper administration of justice. And the proper administration of justice includes protecting or encouraging prosecutions. So, I mean, we have a big problem in Canada that victims of sexual abuse don't come forward because, they don't want their name splashed all over the media. They don't want to go through the whole process of the court, which will, re-victimize them and make them relive the whole experience and all that kind of stuff. They've got to go through the trial. Of course, you can't remove yourself from that, but this at least does provide some possibility of protection from the publicity of it. Okay, I'm going to move on and talk a little bit now about the idea of regulating platforms. And I just want to be clear that in Canada, we don't at the moment have any rule on that. We had a bill in the last Parliament that wasn't passed before Parliament was dissolved, so the bill died. But I have heard on good sources that this bill is still being worked on within the government of Canada, and that we're likely to see it being tabled over the next few months. So watch that space, I would say. So the problem, and probably you all at least as aware of this as I am, but I mean, online intermediaries and especially social media platforms have massively enabled free speech. I mean, that's a very positive thing that they've done. Now we can all speak. I mean, we can speak to the world through our, through our websites and our Facebook pages and things like that. But at the same time, this has included a lot of so-called lawful but awful speech, nasty, biased, misogynist things which don't rise to the level of hate speech or, non-consensual sharing of intimate images, but which are just nasty. And the platforms swirl this speech around, so it's not just one person saying something, it can become thousands of people saying something, a speech which gets multiplied and boosted and whatever. And I mean, this has arguably resulted in skewed election results. I won't mention any specific examples of that, but I mean, living in Canada, we don't have to look too far to see a possible example of that. It certainly has massively supported hatred, online hatred and online harassment, often leading to offline violence, although those forms of victimization are also considered to be violence online. So sort of, online violence, but also leading to, building to offline violence. And indeed, it has the effect, especially for women, of hounding speakers out of the public sphere. And there's good statistics on this. If women say strong, controversial things online, they are almost certainly going to get blowback. And that blowback can often be very nasty, very unpleasant, and often whipped up by the platforms. So you almost have to be quite a brave person to be willing to say, as a woman, to be saying sort of strong things online that people don't, a lot of people don't want to hear, because something is going to come back at you, and there's a distinct gender element to that, and that's very well established. So this problem is out there. I think we all know and feel it and worry about it. So the interesting thing, I mean, Facebook goes back to 2004, and so for 15 years, almost 15 years, I mean, nobody did anything. No country around the world sought to regulate this, even though the problems, which are getting worse and worse, and of course AI is going to, boost those problems, although it might also give us better tools to address them. But nobody did anything. We just let it fester there, which is kind of a remarkable thing. And just to contrast, I mean, AI, we're not doing that. We are regulating AI much more quickly. AI is sort of, just upon us. Not really, but I mean, it's becoming much more significant in our lives, and our governments have moved quickly to regulate AI. We did not do that with the platforms. The first country really to do it was Germany with the so-called NetzDG law. I won't go into the details about that, but it's interesting that, I mean, free speech advocates, and I include myself as a free speech advocate, I was not hostile to the NetzDG law, but most people in my community were very hostile to it. I mean, Germany was sort of, enemy number one for the free speech world for passing this thing. Just 5 years later, the EU, the whole of the EU, the 27 countries in the EU, adopted the Digital Services Act. It came into force 5 years after the NetzDG in November of 22, so just a few years ago. And it went much further than the NetzDG law, and interestingly, people have kind of, Germany was the first to stick its neck out, but now it's kind of, become fairly accepted, I would say. So there are two key parts of it. The first is a notice and takedown rule. So if content is on a platform that's identified as illegal and the platform is notified about it, they have to take it down. I'm not going to go into that. As a free speech activist, I do find that problematical. I don't like that approach. There are other more free speech friendly approaches, but it's not really relevant to the GBB thing that we're talking about today. So I won't go into that. But what is much more significant and potentially important, although we don't yet know how it's going to work, is the very large platforms. So those with 45 million or more users in the European Union, so about 10% of the European population, have to conduct annual assessments of significant systemic risks arising from the use and functioning of their services. Annually, they have to assess this. The dissemination of illegal content, okay, that's sort of the hate speech, intimate images play. Negative impacts on privacy, freedom of expression, prohibition of discrimination, including against women, obviously, and the rights of the child. And then intentional manipulation of their service, which has a negative impact on issues like health, minors, civic discourse, elections, and public security. So, I mean, well embedded within this package here is, harassment of women, nasty gender speech, harassment of anyone on the basis of gender, of course, not just women, but primarily women. So, this is very broad. This is absolutely not limited to illegal speech. It includes legal speech, the impact of the service on these things. And then they have to put in place reasonable, proportionate, and effective mitigation measures tailored to the systemic risks they've identified. So if, just to use an example, Facebook finds that there's a lot of, harassment of women on its platform, or gender-based harassment on its platform, and it's causing problems, it's causing attacks, it's causing violence, it's hounding people out of the public sphere, it needs to do something about it. What it does will have to be tailored to the risks and, of course, to the options and the possibilities of how the platform works, including its automated systems for, its recommender systems or its content moderation systems. It can't just sort of say, oh, sorry about that, but we're not doing anything. That's what, companies like Facebook for a long, long time said, we're not speakers. We're just facilitating speech. It's other people that are doing the speaking. We're not responsible for that. Now the European Union said, no, that's not how it is. You're providing the main platform for all the speaking that's going on. You gotta make sure it's not doing harm. It's very early days. We're just in the first cycle of these assessments and the reaction. And what happens is the platforms do their own assessment, but the regulators, accept or don't accept those assessments and the package of mitigation measures as enough. So they say, yes, okay, that's a reasonable assessment and the mitigation is good enough. Or they say, hang on, no, that's not good enough. Go and do a better one. G it up. And there are a bunch of tools that they have, available to them. In this first round, what we've seen is that the regulators are being fairly hands-off. They're letting the platforms play the game for the first round. That doesn't surprise me. I sort of expected them to do that. I think what will be interesting is in the second and the third round, whether they keep letting the platforms kind of run the game, or they start ratcheting up the pressure on the platforms and say, that was okay the first round, but now we're into the second round, you are causing problems, you've got to do more. So it will be kind of interesting to see. And just for example, there's an investigation in the European Union right now as to whether Grok complies with the standards in their rules. I hope all of you have heard of Grok, and I hope none of you have used it, because it's an awful AI tool that's really problematical. But it might quite well be that the Europeans ban Grok in Europe. So I mean, just to give you a sense, they're investigating it now. All right, so Canada, and I'm not going to spend a long time on this because this is not Canadian law. And I believe that what the government, this new government, which is very different, although it's still a Liberal government, very different from the previous government, I believe that what they come back with might quite well be very different from this. And I would just mention, I mean, the European Union can regulate broadly. Here in Canada, we have a constitutional division of powers. So the federal government cannot regulate everything. Some things fall into the provincial jurisdiction, like, for example, education and healthcare, and a lot of things fall into the provincial jurisdiction. So the federal government is somewhat limited in the way that it can regulate, and that doesn't apply to the EU. So the EU is covering all of those things, children. So like our government can't regulate harm against children because, harm against children can take place in schools or in other places, and they just can't regulate that thing. So, so they slightly have their hands tied in this area. So the Canadian one would apply again to social media services above a certain size. The size wasn't hardwired into the bill. It was going to be set by regulation. And it defines harmful content in two ways. And here you'll see it's much, much more limited than the European rule. Intimate content communicated without consent. So that's, non-consensual distribution of intimate images, basically. Content that sexually victimizes a child or re-victimizes a survivor. So that's, criminally illegal content. Induces a child to harm themselves, is used to bully a child, foments hatred. So I've highlighted that one because that's an important one. Incites violence or incites violent extremism or terrorism. So if we contrast that to the European rules, this is much closer to the criminal law. The Europeans weren't bothered about the criminal law. Anything that undermines or that's promotes discrimination, that harms equality, whether it's criminal or not, they want the platforms to investigate. Here we have a much narrower package. So, and then there's a long list of things the platforms must do. They must mitigate the risks that users are exposed to this content. So that's quite a broad, general thing. And the factors that the commission should take into account establishes a commission to deal with this issue, an independent oversight body, a regulator, to determine if the mitigation is adequate. So that's a general rule. Platforms got to, limit people seeing this stuff, produce user guidelines, enable users to block other users from finding or communicating with them. So that could be quite important for victims of gender-based violence. Enable users to flag easily harmful content. So it must be much easier for users to say, hey, do something about that. That's harmful, and so on. Bunch of measures. I was going to spend a little bit of time doing a human rights assessment of this. I think I'm going to skip that because I'm kind of already at time here. I do want to talk just a little tiny bit about the regulation of artificial intelligence because that's quite an important new phenomenon. We'll spend 2 or 3 minutes on this. I mean, AI obviously does create risks, and we're seeing that in a lot of ways. Grok is an AI tool, and I mean, if you haven't heard of Grok, just go and look at some of the articles on it. It's being highly criticized for the harms it causes. But AI also, of course, generates huge benefits. So we need AI, but we need to kind of control the risks. And I mean, I just as a personal thing, I put this just to give a sense of how AI kind of spruce things up, as it were. So I have several sisters with their families living nearby, and I invite them for a Christmas party every year. So I sent out exactly this invitation, in quotes. We are planning this year's Christmas party for Monday, 22 December. We're inviting people for 2 p.m., which should give those who don't want to drive in the dark time to stay for a decent amount of time before heading home. So, some of my sisters don't like to drive in the dark. Love you all, Toby. So that's to my sisters and their families. So one of my sisters ran that through an AI tool, and it comes back and says, you are invited to the Christmas party at the Center for Law and Democracy. So my organization, the Center for Law and Democracy, it's in my signature, but there was no mention in the invitation AI assumes that basically organizations have Christmas parties and not individuals. So it stuck that in there all of its own. On Monday, 22 December, 2 p.m., so I got that bit right, with the option to stay for dinner before returning home. There is nothing about dinner in my invitation. Of course, we serve food at that Christmas party, but they assume that Christmas parties have dinners, so they stuck it in there. And then they didn't understand at all about the issue of heading home before it gets dark. Instead, it was sort of an option to stay for dinner or not if you wanted to or whatever. So, I mean, it's a completely innocuous, non-harmful example. But what you see is the way that AI basically builds in its own assumptions. It trolls the internet to find stuff, and it rams assumptions and generalizations and things into the process, and therefore distorts it. So what we have here is a fairly significant distortion based on its trolling and its assumptions. So can be quite damaging in other contexts. And just again to talk about the European Union, because they have by far the most comprehensive regulation of AI. They categorize AI into four main categories: unacceptable risk, and they ban it. So includes subliminal, manipulative, or deceptive techniques to distort behavior and impair decision-making, causing significant harm, like deepfakes. So stuff like that is banned in the EU. You can't have it. And so, I mean, I think, a lot of those items will definitely be active in the, GVB space. High risk systems are highly regulated. For example, systems which can recognize your emotions. If an AI system is designed to understand how you feel, as opposed to just interpreting the text of your messages, it's kind of probing into your emotions, then it's considered high risk and it's highly regulated. Then the third category is general purpose AI, like ChatGPT, systems which you can kind of use there. They do things which can be integrated into a lot of different activities, which can be perfectly innocuous or could be highly risky. So they're also highly regulated. And then minimal risk applications. And they have a very legal and complicated way of distinguishing between them. But that's what that's how they're categorizing AI. And they place significant risk mitigation obligations on the high risk and GPAI, general purpose ones. For example, they have to have risk management systems. They have to track modifications of the system over time. So one of the features of the unique features of AI is it changes over time. So I don't know if some of you are regular users of like ChatGPT or another tool like Gemini. As you interact with it, it gets to know you and it changes. It gets more sophisticated, it gets more responsive. But that's what it's supposed to get more responsive, but it also changes. They need to be able to track how it's changing and the ways in which it changes. Because if it starts to go off the rails in a harmful way, they need to know about it. They must ensure that human sight is always possible, even over time as the thing develops. So, we're not going to get into the matrix with these rules because they're going to, stop it before it gets out of control. And they need to provide the regulator with a lot of detail on how it trains itself. So they call that training when the AI systems learn. So for example, if you use ChatGPT, you're training it to serve you by learning and knowing you better. So the more questions and queries you put in there, it starts, and as you modify your queries, it starts to say, okay, this is what this person generally wants, and I'm going to come back with that. It's training itself on you. So there has to be a lot of detail on that. So this is really a new space. This just came into place very recently. We need to see how it will develop. That's really an unknown. But the Europeans, at least, both for platforms and for AI, they are attempting at least to regulate it. Let's see how that goes. So I'll come to an end with that. Went a little bit over my time, but hopefully not too long. And I will stop sharing. And over to you, Talia.
Thank you so much, Toby. And thank you to both speakers. We've had such an incredibly vast and comprehensive overview on gender-based violence and how it affects all areas of society. I won't take too much time now because we're definitely running low on it. So I think now's a perfect time for us to take a 10-minute break. Everyone kind of relax a little bit, get some water, get some tea, take a little breath of fresh air. And so it's 2:17 right now. I'd say be ready to come back at 2:27 Eastern time. And we'll be able to dive into the discussion straight away. I can see we already have a lot of questions going on in the Q&A, so I'm excited to look at those more with the two of you in 10 minutes. See you all soon.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope we've enjoyed our little break. Sorry if we needed more time, but I think we should keep moving things forward because our viewers have been pretty active in the chat. I have a lot of questions to get through. So if you two don't mind, I say let's get started. So lots of the questions I see are framed kind of towards one or the other of you individually. I'd like if we can try as best as possible to keep things really interactive. So for example, I think I'll start off with a question that's directed towards Jamila, but Toby, if we can incorporate it to anything that you've been talking about that you think is relevant, I think great. If not, then I'll move on and we'll see which questions kind of facilitate the most interesting discussions. So Jamila, if you don't mind, like I said, I'll start with you. So quite a few questions that have been sparked in your presentation. Thank you so much. The first question that I have here on the list is what changes, and I think we would be a good one to discuss for the two of you. What do you think changes when violence is framed as a legal crime rather than as a humanitarian issue?
That's a great question. And I kind of touched on it a bit in my presentation, but so when violence is framed as a humanitarian issue, the option or the response is essentially optional, shaped by things we see just as a reaction, sympathy on funding cycles, governments, on political will, who's the party of the day, essentially. But when it's framed in as a legal crime, the response becomes mandatory, right? So illegal framing triggers us to prevent, to investigate, to prosecute, to repair harm to communities and individuals. It shifts away from survivors as recipients of AIDS to essentially holders of rights, which is what we want to believe justice and law is there to do for individuals who do come forward. So it really shapes and shifts from states, from helpers to accountable actors in the international space when crimes of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity and that nature do happen. So in the context of conflict-related sexual violence, that distinction is really everything, because justice cannot depend on compassion alone, in any court.
I could just weigh in on that. I mean, I think it depends a little bit what we mean by those terms. So, I mean, there is a whole body of law called humanitarian law, and Jamila, you just mentioned crimes against humanity and things. Those are those are in the area of humanitarian law. So I mean, I think one way of understanding humanitarian is sort of, we need to aid these people, or we need to voluntarily, as Jamila said, give them something. But most of the serious crimes that well, I mean, a lot of the issues that we're talking about here are indeed crimes under national law, and in many cases, especially if things take place in an armed conflict, because humanitarian law is about armed conflicts, applies in the context of armed conflicts, whether they're internal or external, then they are humanitarian legal issues, and they do raise the bar to the legal one that Jamila was mentioning. I certainly agree that there's a very significant difference between legal obligations and legal rights, which are kind of the flip side of each other, and simply sort of sympathy related measures. But within the humanitarian space, there is a very developed body of law, and indeed, war crimes and crimes against humanity, those are all related to the humanitarian law as a field. So there's,
Yeah, absolutely.
Humanitarian in the two different senses, I think, is probably the
I think that's a really good distinction to make, because if it can, of course, be a humanitarian issue, and it can be a matter of humanitarian law and also a matter of national criminal law, in which case it is a legal crime. And then maybe the question also is framed more towards whether it is framed as a legal crime in Canada, and whether it's worth noting the recognition there as well. For example, the War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity Act in Canada, and to that extent. But on that note of the difference in framing and what effect that has for the victims and the potential of accountability, justice, and redress for them, the next question I think is good to think about what risks, this is the next question, what risks arrive when definitions of conflict-related sexual violence and gender-based violence are diluted or depoliticized in legal and policy discussion. I think this feeds into the previous question, thinking about in order to have that momentum, in order to advocate for knowledge of what's going on, to protect against the diluting or depoliticization of these issues in a societal context and in a political context, and how that work of activists and of civil society and of individuals and communities, diaspora, can work towards pushing for recognition of a certain cause or a crime or a humanitarian issue that perhaps isn't on the radar for people within a community here back home. Anyone, can we talk a little bit about that? Is that a bit too broad?
Maybe I could start with a couple of comments. I mean, I'm not sure if the term depoliticized is meant like that or is meant to be politicized. I'm not sure. But I mean, legal and policy discussions should be depoliticized.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We shouldn't adopt law, I mean, of course, different political parties and different political orientations have different views about what laws should be adopted, but I mean, laws should not, and certainly in the human rights field and the humanitarian law field as well, laws should not be politicized. They should be, they should protect human rights regardless of political stripe, and policy is not. Is more flexible in that regard, but even there, I think we do want to see policy being, largely depoliticized. So I'm not sure if that was like a typo mistake or there's another element that's being got at there. But from a legal point of view, I would say that it's good to depoliticize. Essentially, is needed, and after laws are adopted, the implementation of those laws absolutely has to be depoliticized. We can't have laws applied, politically. I mean, that's a phenomenon that we're seeing to the south of the border, and I think that most Canadians are sort of looking down with slightly aghast with horror and at that aspect of things, among many others. It's in the news all the time, and I don't think too many people in Canada feel that that's a good thing. But the other part of it, of course, about diluting, that's very important. And there is, I mean, I in my comments spoke about speech and gender-based violence, and there it's a tricky balance, to be honest, because obviously democracies and human rights believe in strong protection for free speech and not limiting speech too much. But when speech becomes actually harmful, then we do regulate it, and hate speech and non-consensual sharing of intimate images are two areas where there are limits on that, and there are others, obviously, and the human rights piece that I didn't get into in my presentation about the platforms, and I think that this was one of the problems why sort of everybody was so all the governments in the world were so hands off on platforms for so long, was that it was sort of seen as a free speech place, and we shouldn't interfere for that reason. But actually, it was doing a lot of harm, and we can't allow harms to percolate in our society without regulating them. Even if there is a free speech element, we need the balance there, and that's what needs to be achieved in this space. And I think the thing that people didn't understand or weren't factoring in their decisions not to regulate earlier on, and still most countries don't regulate, or a lot of countries don't regulate, was that there's a big difference between criminalizing an individual speaker, saying you can't say that or you might go to jail. Okay, that's a very specific and harsh form of punishment, and very chilling on free speech. And saying to the platforms, you've got to stop whipping up the crappy stuff and start balancing it by promoting some of the good stuff, regardless of what that does to engagement, regardless of the impact on your business model, regardless of whether you retain eyeballs on your platform. Because, unfortunately, people go for their toxic stuff more, and it keeps them on the platform more, and the platform spread that more because of that. That's their business model. They want to keep you on there as long as possible, and spreading nasty stuff is more effective as a business model for them. That's not okay. And I mean, they got their business model's working very well for them. They're making quite a bit of money. They've got to trim that to protect us. And I think we need to understand that in a very different way as a free speech issue than saying, Toby Mendel, you said something that we're going to criminalize you for. Instead, saying, oh, Toby Mendel said something nasty, something sexist, something biased. I hope I don't do that, but let's say, platforms tamp that down instead of pushing it up. Take a hit on your business model and push the nice stuff, push the egalitarian promoting stuff and whatever. Address those things and take a little bite on your business model, and because we are not going to tolerate you promoting the worst sort of stuff. That is, I mean, there are free speech issues inside of that, but it's a completely different free speech issue than the criminalizing of individual speakers. We're much more talking about profits of these companies for spreading the wrong stuff rather than just having a level playing field of speech, and that's a lot what we hope the DSA will start to address.
No, absolutely. I think those are amazing points. Yeah, sorry, Jamila.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I took it in that way too. So when it's politicized, when the issue of, CRSB and GBV do get politicized, it ultimately becomes diluted, right? Which in turn then weakens prosecutions, it narrows state responsibilities, it shifts burdens back onto survivors and communities who've been targeted. And takes away from the accountability then on sort of institutions and states and things like that. And Toby, your comments and presentation is so interesting. Just the times we're living in, right? Everything is so real world and happening. I mean, we see non-state actors, terrorist groups like ISIS. Social media was one of their biggest recruitment strategies, was through these social media platforms. Facebook, and X, and a number of different ones, and the content they were posting. I mean, we always say, genocide. Sort of that first step is hate speech. It's dehumanization. It's the language they're using to other a group, and then take that online. And we know the data says how fast hate messages spread compared to other types of content, right? It's like the data is there to support all this, and we know these sort of malicious actors, whether it be a terrorist or an individual with ill intentions, maybe on a sliding scale of where people are between oh, I hate this political party, to let's kill this one group or target this one group or join this cause to target and kill a certain group. We know that's definitely a very dangerous trend, and we've seen it. We've seen other sort of terror groups use that as recruitment as well. I mean, we don't have to go far in history, although, with the times we live in, 12 years of ISIS, 2014 seems a long time ago. We see, Hamas, Hezbollah, disinformation by states like, the Russian and stuff like that, seeing this disinformation spread a lot quicker than, let's say, the good news stories and things like that. So definitely an ongoing thing we're looking at in this space. And, of course, it'll be interesting to see which route Canada takes now that it's sort of scrapped that old policy, and see where we go from here.
Yeah, no, of course, I think that's very interesting. And when we're talking about politicization and political influence, it can, of course, go two ways. I was thinking on the other end of things, there are causes that fail to gather political support for them as well.
Mm-hmm.
But of course,
that was what I wondered about what they meant by depoliticized. If by depoliticized they mean de-emphasized,
yes,
nobody's paying any attention to it.
Politicized first before it can be depoliticized, and in that sense, we would hope that everything, especially if already achieving the status of law would be outside of of political influence. But unfortunately, that's not always the world that we live in.
But you have to get
we have to
get the attention of political actors to get a law passed in the first place, right? So yeah, I mean, so
exactly.
if by depoliticizing means sort of low attention or whatever, not given sufficient importance in social weight, then that's a different thing. Yeah,
to the extent that's necessary.
yeah.
Exactly. And so on that note, I'll try to be fast because we are running low on time, but for the cases where we do have political support for a cause that we want political support, this next question again for Jamila, sorry, but Canada has taken notable steps, including parliamentary recognition of the Yazidi genocide and family reunification policies, as you spoke of. And in your view, what responsibilities do states like Canada have beyond recognition, especially in ensuring access to justice domestically?
Yeah.
So I think this means domestically within Canada.
Yeah, that's how I'll take that as well. And like most things, recognition is just the starting point, not an end point, right? Beyond recognition, states like Canada have a responsibility to make justice usable in practice through survivor-centered legal pathways, access to independent legal advice, trauma-informed processes, credible accountability mechanisms. And of course, this includes supporting investigations under war crimes frameworks, reducing procedural barriers, funding these bodies appropriately, reducing barriers that re-traumatize survivors. The Murad Code is a great one to follow, especially when interviewing survivors of conflict-related sexual violence or anything of that nature. In the Yazidi case, ensuring family reunification, documentation, legal status issues are resolved without placing the burden back on those who survived the violence itself. And just underscoring, each community has its own, I'd say, justice and healing framework that they go on. We know there's still open cases from, the Rwandan genocide, and many other cases of sort of these injustices throughout history. So when I speak, when I talk about family reunification, the Yazidi case, oftentimes survivors say there isn't a single Yazidi family that's been left whole post this genocide. So family reunification and rebuilding that unit is so core to, identity, who they are and how they move forward, which is why we focused all of our efforts, post sort of 2017 on advocacy and, creating awareness around the importance of family reunification for these survivors. And, the data supports it across the board for refugees. When families are able to reunify, how can you be expected to sort of settle when, a sibling or a mother or a child is sitting in a refugee camp or an IDP camp, somewhere else across the world? And then you add on, the level of trauma that the Yazidis and the Yazidi women in particular sort of experienced. And for many of those who arrived in Canada, it was like airlifted, post captivity, some of them like 2 weeks or something like that from camps in Iraq straight to Canada. So the trauma was just so fresh for everybody. And that sort of, so in that mindset, family reunification really became, the only light. And now we're sort of now within sort of a war crimes framework, what does, justice look like in a courtroom for many of these individuals?
Thank you so much. So I'll continue. There's a very interesting question here for Toby with regards to your presentation. In your opinion, why does Canadian law include such strong defenses, such as for truth, public interest, and religious opinion?
That's defenses to hate speech.
Yes. Well, it doesn't say so in the question, if that's what you're asking, but this was within the context of
Yes. So I mean, I think that's that's part of the balance. I mean, this difficult balancing I talked about before between, on the one hand, I mean, Canada, I believe, has very strong values and commitment to equality as a human right, but it also has strong values and commitment to freedom of expression. I think, within the Canadian framework, both of those rights are very valued, and we need to balance the two of them. And I mean, I think it's always easy to look at speech regulation and think about the bad speech that needs to be regulated, and think that's one perspective on how to generate the rules. But you also always need to keep in mind the possibility of these rules being misapplied in the wrong sorts of circumstances. And I mean, the Herschel case, which I mentioned, although I don't think the Danish authorities had any bad intentions there, but they did not clearly understand the balance between free speech and hate speech. And they also didn't really do a proper social analysis of what was happening, because, I mean, I think that would have led them not to proffer that prosecution. So I think, when we design rules that limit speech, we need to design them so as far as possible to be foolproof against abuse by the authorities, whether that's intentional or just by sort of clumsy bureaucratic behavior, if I can put it like that. So those defenses within the framework of the hate speech rules are important. Truth is not a defense to every claim of speech. So if you invade someone's privacy, you can say something about them. And the intimate images crime, I mean, an image, if it's not distorted, is a true statement. It's a proper picture. I mean, images can be distorted as well, but assuming that that's not the case, you're still not allowed to share them if they're intimate and they haven't been consented to, or the sharing hasn't been consented to. So that's a case. Or invasions of privacy of other sorts. So that is, in a way, an invasion of privacy, basically, but a very specific form of that. Invasions of privacy, those involve the dissemination of true statements, still not allowed in many cases. Or again, there's a framework for balancing with free speech. So it's not like true things are always protected, but there's a very strong thread running through the regulation of speech, which says, people should be able to say true things, basically, and even if there are some incidental negative impacts on that. On the public good defense to the intimate images crime, I'm not sure if that has ever successfully been maintained. I think that when Canada, and I think it's a good defense if it could be made out, because serving the overall public good generally is a justification for speech. Not always, but almost always. We allow speech which serves the public good, even if it also does some harm elsewhere. Maybe we balance those two. And so, for example, when privacy and free speech come into conflict, which happens frequently, if the media are publishing personal details about a politician, but that's important because we need to know those details, whatever they are, or what, that's the kind of, the courts will balance the public interest. How important is the privacy interest? What was the public interest in that speech? Which one's greater? So I think that this one doesn't have a balancing, but that idea that we're going to allow speech which serves the public good, again, is a very fundamental thread running through free speech. I think it would be hard to make out in that particular context you're sharing. Like even the example I gave of the politician, I mean, you can expose that they were involved in a extramarital affair contrary to what they're always saying in Parliament, without showing those images. For example, even if as I was trying to frame that example, I was kind of thinking, this is not the best example. So I don't know, whether there is any actual example of that. And I think also we need to understand that when Canada was adopting these, it was kind of cutting edge around the world. There wasn't much experience with these rules around the world, and probably the framers of that, that legislation wanted to make sure that they were at least putting in a protection in case there was a public interest example, should that arise, even if it's kind of far-fetched in practice. They just wanted to be sure that they weren't over-limiting free speech. So important to balance these two issues.
Absolutely. Very important to balance, and with public interest, always difficult to navigate. And I think the truth as a defense is incredibly tricky as well, because to me it's counterintuitive. You can absolutely hate someone on the basis of something that is true. It doesn't have to be false. Maybe that's a good segue into this next question, and maybe we could keep it as a final question, or if Jamila, if you want to add anything now, since we're closing up on time, because if you're speaking, then maybe I won't go through more questions.
Nope, I think you guys got it. I'm just, watching the precedents that are being set from all these different court cases, right? Because that'll then determine sort of how this future of all this talk shapes out in terms of, hate speech.
Well, then if you don't mind, I think I'll go to this next one, because I think it was tied very much to Toby, what you were saying just now, and connected to the previous question. And it's, if the government tries to control harmful speech, could that make people, marginalized groups, afraid to speak at all? So maybe this is to touch base on the defense to hate speech. Could it make them afraid to speak at all, even when what they want to say is valid, maybe in other words true, and important, and for that sense, maybe in favor of the public good?
But I try to address that one. Yeah, I think so. First of all, there's, within the free speech world, we talk about chilling effect, which really is what that is referring to. And chilling effect can arise from a lot of sources, particularly when laws are vague. So people think, oh, that could apply, even though it doesn't. Or it could be used in those circumstances. In Canada, vague speech restricting laws should ultimately be struck down by the courts, although there's always a measure of vagueness in laws, because language is not mathematics, words are not numbers. You can't, languages can never be perfectly precise, but governments, parliaments need to be as precise as they can when framing the language of restrictions on freedom of expression. But I think there's also, I mentioned that the Bill C-9 would introduce a new provision which would specifically criminalize promoting hatred, so the same as we already have, by using various symbols, Nazi and terrorist symbols. And we made a submission to the UN on free speech in Canada, including that particular bill, because it's obviously current. And one of the arguments we made there was, promoting hatred's already criminalized. So why do you need to promote hatred, to further criminalize the promotion of hatred in this way and that way and that way? You could have 100 of those things. And when you specifically mention things like Nazi symbols and whatever, if you're using them to promote hatred, they're already captured. But when people see that in the legislation, they might think they're not allowed to use Nazi symbols, which is absolutely not the case. You can use a Nazi symbol in a spoof or in a, to criticize a politician. It's an extreme way to criticize a politician, but you're perfectly allowed to do it as long as you're not promoting hatred through that. You're just criticizing the politician, so you're perfectly allowed to use those. But when you use specific language like that in legislation when it's already criminalized anyway, it might give the wrong impression. So I think, governments do need to be careful when they draft things, but also sometimes people may misunderstand the rules and think that they're not allowed to say things which they are. And then, it's to some extent, it's a question of education and that sort of thing. And so that's a little bit why I went into such detail on hate speech, because it's important that people understand most, even nasty speech, isn't hate speech. So there's both two sides to it.
Thank you so much. No, I think every aspect of this conversation has been more than important. We've received another very nice message / question, not really question, in the chat that I'll just read out loud now if you haven't seen it, to hear. Dear Toby, Jamila, and Talia, thank you so much. This was a really important conversation. Women are often the ones who suffer the most under oppressive systems, and you explained this so clearly. You help people understand and think On behalf of my team and this community, thank you. And this is from our wonderful executive director here at Northern Justice Watch, Sharif. Thank you so much for this message and for your kind words. And on that note, maybe I will just bring it back to the whole point of this discussion here and this seminar series. And just looking back on this conversation, I think it's amazing the breadth of the discussion that we've had and really the breadth of this issue on sexual and gender-based violence, because we've spoken about sexual and gender-based violence in the context of conflict to the extent of gender-based persecution and even as a tool of genocide. And then in the same seminar, we discussed issues of hate speech and sharing of intimate images and regulation of online content. And this really just shows, like I mentioned before, that this issue, gender-based violence, permeates and pervades almost every single aspect of society. So it's a very big issue and a very difficult issue for us to tackle, but I'm happy that we got together and we had a time to really address this. I hope our viewers have also enjoyed this discussion and our presentations from our wonderful speakers. As a final note, I'd like to open it up to the two of you to give your closing statements if there's anything else that you'd like to say or to highlight as maybe a hopeful message going forward.
Sure. Maybe I'll just, reiterate with how I sort of closed my talk earlier. And thank you, Talia, so much for being such a great moderator of this conversation. And I'll just end by saying that, access to justice is not simply about whether laws exist. It's really about whether survivors can understand them, can trust them, can use them. So it really boils right down to knowing rights versus live rights. And that's a really big distinction there. And, really what gives me hope in this space is when, survivors feel all those things and are able to come forward, and testify and whether it be, coming back into community or testifying in domestic and international tribunals and courts to get the justice that they so rightly deserve. And, specifically with the Yazidi case here in Canada, my hope is that, communities continue to organize at that grassroots level, even though sometimes these issues feel so high level and all the way up here. I'd say for, in the case of the Yazidi genocide and the response here in Canada, that really did come from the grassroots. It came from building coalitions with, groups we thought we never would. A great sort of story of how the Yazidi sort of organized here in Winnipeg was in partnership with the Jewish community here. And if you know much about that area of the world, we've had very complex histories, and not because of relationship, but because of what has been passed down historically from person to person. So, really building those neighbor to neighbor relationships and building those coalitions at the grassroots level, and understanding that, we are really stronger together. And when we create those safe blankets and spaces with organizations, we allow and create safe spaces for survivors then to come forward and, take on that healing journey. So I will, I'll end there. Thank you.
Well, that's a lovely sentiment to me. My closing remarks will not be as evocative as that, but I'd just say that, I mean, the issue of regulating platforms, regulating AI is enormously complex. It's also very politically controversial. As I mentioned in my comments, sort of, 2017, Germany became enemy number one of the free speech community because they, started this business. And now the Europeans have regularized it, but they're one of the only jurisdictions that, in my opinion, has a sophisticated, as yet untested system for that. Most of the rest of us, Canada, still talking about its legislation, and the AI space is going to enormously complicate that and also intensify it, because AI will sort of, run that stuff on steroids, basically. So I think it's really, really important for Canadians to not be knee-jerk about that. And I'm my background is a free speech activist, but I've seen a lot of knee-jerk reactions from free speech activists in that space, including the Germany number one enemy business, which dissipated pretty quickly, but still. And I think, we need to find the right balance, this difficult balance that I've been talking about quite a lot in this Q&A part. And part of that is regulating platforms because they're harming our societies, including on this issue we're talking about and many, many other issues. We need to have an appropriate balance, as we have found in other areas, in defamation law, in hate speech law, and whatever. And we can do that, but we need to be mature, and we need to understand the free speech issues and the other issues, including harm to equality and other things that we hold very dear. So difficult balance going forward, but hopefully Canada can do it well, like I think the Europeans basically have.
Well, thank you so much. What a great note to finish on. Thank you so much to both of you for your incredible insight and expertise on the topics of our discussion today. We'll close things here. Just a final note that there was a question asked whether we can have access to the PowerPoints after the seminar. Of course, the video will be available and posted both on YouTube and on our website, as I understand. And whether Toby or Jamila, you have any plans of sharing your slides. If anyone's interested, you can always get in touch with us via northernjusticewatch@gmail.com. You can also find that information on the website, and I'm sure we'll be able to share any information that might be valuable or interesting to you. So as a final note, thank you.
Very happy to share my slides.
Great. Amazing. So thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to Northern Justice Watch and the whole team and all of our viewers.